If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. On the night of April 2nd and into the early morning of April 3rd, 1865, Richmond burned as Robert E. Lee began moving the Army of Northern Virginia out of the siege lines of Petersburg and Richmond and to the west, hopefully making it to Amelia Courthouse, and then push south to join Joseph E. Johnston's Army of Tennessee in North Carolina. Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry and Richard Anderson's small corps were already on the south side of the Appomattox River. Those in Petersburg would cross to the north side of the Appomattox River, but to get to Amelia Courthouse, Lee knew they would need to recross it further west. Richard Ewell's Richmond defense troops crossed the James River and would head west along the Richmond and Danville Railroad. Before the Army moved out, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet left from that same railroad line station in Richmond, destined for Danville, Virginia. At a little after 3 a.m. on April 3rd, troops from the 9th Corps and some from the 6th Corps made it into Petersburg, with troops from the 25th Corps proceeding into Richmond. Both cities surrendered to nearby Union commanders. Confederate forces set fire to warehouses before leaving both cities, and the fires began to spread in Richmond. Godfrey Watzel, the Union commander occupying Richmond, dispatched troops to put out the fires. Richmond residents broke into stores during the chaos of the evacuation and turned the once Confederate capital into a chaotic scene of mob rule. Watzel helped put an end to the destruction. It was after 8 a.m. that morning when Army of the Potomac commander George Meade found General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant at Thomas Wallace's house in Petersburg on Market Street. They discussed the next steps in the pursuit of Lee. They agreed that Lee would retreat along the Richmond and Danville Railroad, and to chase him would only result in him getting away. They needed to cut Lee off from the south. With that strategy in mind, Meade left to go make arrangements. Another person found Grant at the Wallace house that morning. It was President Abraham Lincoln. He was thrilled with Grant's progress and sat down to join him in discussion. Lincoln said, "Do you know, General, I had a sort of sneaking idea all along that you intended to do something like this. But I thought some time ago that you would so maneuver as to have Sherman come up and be near enough to cooperate with you." Grant replied, "Yes, I thought at the time that Sherman's army might advance far enough to be in supporting distance of the Eastern armies when the spring campaign against Lee opened. But I had a feeling that it would be better to let Lee's old antagonist give his army the final blow and finish the job. If the Western troops were even to put in an appearance against Lee's army, it might give some of our politicians a chance to stir up sectional feeling in claiming everything for the troops from their own section of the country. The Western armies have been successful in their campaigns, and it is due to the Eastern armies to let them vanquish their old enemy single-handedly." Lincoln traveled to Richmond, walking along its streets, and even went into the mansion of Jefferson Davis, the White House of the Confederacy, where the lanky executive sat in the reception chair of the reception room of the house. The home soon became the headquarters of Godfrey Watzel. Soon Grant set off to join his armies in the push westward to cut Lee off. Lee took a respite at Clover Hill, the home of James H. Cox, where he found out that Bevel's Bridge across the Appomattox River was unusable. This forced Longstreet and John B. Gordon's corps to move north to Good's Bridge, while Ewell's troops crossed further upstream. Along with Longstreet's own troops, he also commanded A.P. Hill's troops following that general's death the day before. To the south, Richard Anderson's corps and Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry battled with Philip Sheridan's cavalry south of the Appomattox River. After fighting with George Armstrong Custer's Union cavalry, Anderson and the cavalry pressed on toward Amelia Courthouse. By the evening of April 3rd, most of Lee's army was on the south or west bank of the Appomattox River, but the Union were marching just as hard to catch up to them. The 5th Corps under Charles Griffin, the 2nd Corps under Andrew Humphreys, and the 6th Corps under Horatio Wright were right behind Sheridan. Edward Ord's Army of the James, consisting of the 24th Corps, moved south of the others, with the 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac behind the 24th Corps. At dawn on April 4th, most of the Army of Northern Virginia assembled at Amelia Courthouse. Going to the train station, the rebels opened up the train cars hoping to find food, but only found ammunition. 350,000 rations were supposed to be waiting on them at that station, but in the series of telegrams sent during April 2nd, a mix-up occurred, and ordnance came instead of food. Lee issued a proclamation to the people of the surrounding countryside saying, To my surprise and regret, I find not a pound of subsistence for man or horse. I must therefore appeal to your generosity and charity to supply, as far as each one is able, the wants of the brave soldiers who have battled for your liberty for 4 years. We require meat, beef, cattle, sheep, hogs, flour, meal, corn, and provender in any quantity that can be spared. The quartermaster of the army will visit you and make arrangements to pay for what he receives or give the proper vouchers or certificates. I feel assured that all will give to the extent of their means. Aside from provisions, Lee also worried about the column coming from Richmond under Richard Ewell. Ewell found that he couldn't cross at the designated bridge along his route, but had to cross at the Richmond and Danville Railroad bridge. Soldiers positioned planks on the railroad ties across the bridge so that they and the artillery could cross. Ewell camped on the south or west bank of the river just a mile from the bridge on the night of the 4th, while the rest of the army stayed at Amelia Courthouse that same night. As Lee waited at that location, the Union armies moved sluggishly on April 4th, with Ord's men only making it to Wilson's Station and the 2nd and 6th Corps moving only a short distance. The major movement came when Sheridan's cavalry and the 5th Corps moved to Jennings' Ordinary, halfway between Jetersville and Burkeville Station. Then, moving to Jetersville, where the infantry fortified either side of the railroad to prevent any provisions from getting to Lee's army. Earlier, Grant intercepted a message from Lee to Danville requesting supplies from that location. Grant intended to stop that from happening. Darkness covering the Virginia countryside saw the armies in those same positions until morning. On the rainy morning of April 5th, Robert E. Lee despaired that the citizens in the surrounding countryside of Amelia Courthouse brought little subsistence to feed his army. The delay, as he later claimed, was fatal. He and his army had no choice but to press on. At about 1 p.m., the Army of Northern Virginia headed out of Amelia Courthouse. Lee initially wanted to head down the railroad as planned, but discovered Philip Sheridan's cavalry and decided to move toward Amelia Springs. By that time, 3 Union Corps were at Jetersville, the 5th Corps in the center, the 2nd Corps on its left, and the 6th Corps on its right. John Gibbon's 24th Corps proceeded to Burkeville Station. Lee planned to hopefully get ahead of the pursuing Yankees by performing a night march as they drove west. Lee got word that 80,000 rations awaited his army at Farmville and directed his army to get to that location. On April 6th, Lee's army was still moving west when the Union troops advanced toward Amelia Courthouse, with the 2nd Corps detecting Lee's movement. They made contact with the retreating enemy, attacking the wagon train and the rear guard made up of John B. Gordon's corps. Ulysses S. Grant reiterated to his army and corps commanders that they needed to get in front of Lee, not just chase him. Edward Ord and his Army of the James, which was basically just the 24th Corps, because the 25th was occupying Richmond, was ordered to attempt to get ahead of Lee and burn the bridge across the Appomattox River known as High Bridge. Ord sent a 3-regiment force under Colonel Francis Washburn to the bridge. Afraid that Confederate cavalry had been sent to hold the bridge, Ord dispatched Brevet Brigadier General Theodore Reed to inform the expedition and take command of it. Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry, urged by Confederate Corps Commander James Longstreet, approached High Bridge to protect it from being burned. Reed's troops arrived at High Bridge and found it guarded by the 3rd Virginia Reserves. Washburn and his 4th Michigan Cavalry chased away the Virginians, but Washburn then heard heavy musketry coming from behind him. The 2 infantry regiments in the Union contingent remained at the Watson Farm and were being attacked by Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry. The horsemen put great pressure on the Federals before Washburn charged into the Confederate lines, with the engagement breaking into hand-to-hand combat. It was a lethal battle, with Reed being killed and Washburn and James Deering being mortally wounded. The rebel horsemen chased the Federals toward the bridge, where the Yankees surrendered. Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry preserved the bridge for Lee's army, particularly the wagon train, to cross. During the Army of Northern Virginia's march, a gap emerged, 2 miles wide in the gray columns, between Longstreet's corps and the rest of the army, due to cavalry attacks against Richard Anderson's corps. Longstreet got to Rice's Depot and ordered his men to throw up breastworks. Meanwhile, Sheridan's Federal cavalry interposed themselves between Longstreet and Anderson. Anderson halted at Marshall's Crossroads, with Richard Ewell's troops at Little Sailor's Creek, just to the north. Gordon's corps guarded the wagon train north of Anderson and Ewell's position. The Union 6th Corps caught up to Ewell, with the 2nd Corps confronting Gordon. At around 6 p.m., the battle, or more accurately, battles of Sailor's Creek, erupted. Sheridan rode with Horatio Wright, the Sixth Corps commander. They held a strong bond because of their dependence on one another in the Shenandoah Valley the previous year. Wright placed his artillery at the Hillsman home, where they could fire projectiles onto the Confederates who had no artillery with which to fire back. The Federal troops advanced across Little Sailor's Creek, putting pressure on the Confederate line. The rebels fired volleys into the approaching blue line, with the 2nd Rhode Island and the 49th Pennsylvania breaking, and the troops of Stapleton Crutchfield giving chase. When the Federals halted, the two sides battled hand to hand. In the attack, Crutchfield was shot through the head, and Robert Stiles took command of the troops. Yankee canister fire drove the Confederates back. Wright renewed his attacks, with his troops inching ever closer until he used his overwhelming numbers to force Ewell's troops to surrender. On the south side of the battlefield, Sheridan's cavalry broke through Richard Anderson's troops as well, forcing 8 generals total to surrender, along with over 7,000 soldiers taken prisoner. General Lee and Longstreet were at Rice's Depot, waiting on the other columns. Lee went to check on them, and from a knoll overlooking the creeks he saw a disorganized mob and exclaimed, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" To the north, John B. Gordon's corps battled with the Union 2nd Corps under Andrew Humphreys. Gordon delayed the Federals long enough to save the wagon train, but lost about 1,700 troops, 13 flags, 3 artillery pieces, and more than 300 wagons and 70 ambulances. Following the battles of Sailor's Creek, Sheridan wrote to Grant that, "If the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender." Grant sent the message to President Abraham Lincoln, and he telegraphed back, "Let the thing be pressed." The 24th Corps pushed toward Rice's Depot, but didn't attack Longstreet's force, which was dug in preparation for an assault. Lee needed to get to his next objective, Farmville. Rations awaited his army in that city. He ordered Longstreet to perform a night march to the town and for Gordon and what was left of Anderson and Ewell's force to cross High Bridge, then burn it, to delay the Federals. April 6th had been a disastrous day for the Confederacy. Close to midnight, Lee received a message from President Jefferson Davis at Danville, Virginia. The message asked if there was an objective point for the Army. Lee answered, "No, I shall have to be governed by each day's developments. A few more Sailor's Creeks and it will all be over, ended, just as I have expected it would end from the first." In the early morning hours of April 7th, James Longstreet and his troops made it to Farmville. Robert E. Lee was happy to see 40,000 rations of bread and 80,000 rations of meal awaiting his army in the train cars at the railroad station. Although happy about the food, he despaired at the time it would take to distribute it to his men. Waiting at Amelia Courthouse had allowed the Union Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James to get ever closer to catching them. Through the night, John B. Gordon's corps used High Bridge and its wagon bridge to cross the Appomattox River. The next morning, the 2nd Corps and the 5th Corps approached High Bridge, finding that the rebels had failed to burn it. They were just beginning to set fire to the western span when the Union troops began to cross. The Federal soldiers hurried to put out the fire on the wagon bridge, but the fire on High Bridge proved more difficult to extinguish. It destroyed part of the bridge, but the bridge for foot traffic below it was still usable. Longstreet moved his corps across the Appomattox River at Farmville, with Lee hoping that putting a waterway in between himself and Ulysses S. Grant might allow the necessary distance to escape the pursuing Federals. At this point, Edward Porter Alexander, Longstreet's artillery chief, informed Lee that the route south of the river was quicker to Appomattox Station than the route north of the river, by about 8 miles. Lee asked Alexander to verify this information, and when he did, Lee grew angry that they had burned the bridges at Farmville. Alexander later wrote, "Indeed, no man who looked at our situation on a map, or who understood the geography of the country, could fail to see that General Grant had us completely in a trap. We were now in a sort of jug-shaped peninsula between the James River and Appomattox, and there was but one outlet, the neck of the jug at Appomattox Court House, and to that Grant had the shortest route." The 2nd Corps caught up to William Mahone's division at Cumberland Church, threatening Lee's wagon train and the entire Confederate army. Quickly, Gordon and Longstreet filed in beside Mahone and began fending off attacks by Andrew Humphreys and his 2nd Corps. The back-and-forth battle saw Lee's army repulse multiple attacks and forcing the Union Corps to fall back. Grant was at Farmville and set up communications with Lee. He sent a message saying, The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the C.S. Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant. Lee studied the message and then handed it to his 1st Corps commander, James Longstreet. Longstreet read it in silence, then handed it back to Lee, saying, "Not yet." Lee then began to draft a message back to Grant, saying that he disagreed with Grant's assessment, but asked for the terms that he offered in the event of a surrender. To escape Grant, Lee knew he would need another night march. Those were wearing on the men, as many had been on their feet between 18 and 40 hours by this point. From the night of the 7th into the morning of the 8th, Lee's army, now basically constituting just 2 worn-out corps under Longstreet and Gordon, moved along parallel paths, with the 6th Corps pursuing Longstreet and the 2nd Corps pursuing Gordon. They were aiming for New Store. It was on the 8th that Lee relieved 3 of his generals from duty, Richard Anderson, George Pickett, and Bushrod Johnson. The last 2 either didn't get informed of their dismissal or ignored the order, because they continued with the army. Anderson was ordered to proceed to his home and then report to the Secretary of War. All 3 men's commands were heavily disorganized from the battles of Sailor's Creek, and their role in the engagement was still in question. Because of the shorter route taken by Gordon, that corps made it to New Store ahead of Longstreet, and they proceeded in that order west of New Store, with the Union troops still in pursuit. The 2nd Corps got ahead of the 6th Corps for the same reason that Gordon got ahead of Longstreet. A message to Lee from Grant reached the Confederate Army commander in the afternoon of the 8th, describing the surrender terms and asking to meet to discuss the arrangement. Lee wrote back, "To be frank, I do not think the emergency has risen to call for the surrender of this army," and he emphasized that he simply wanted to know the terms if a surrender took place. To the west at Appomattox Station, Sheridan's cavalry, with the 24th and 5th Corps right behind, attacked the trains carrying 300,000 rations and a large amount of equipment destined for Lee's army. Worse yet for Lee, Sheridan and 2 Union Corps were now in front of him, blocking him from heading south. By the afternoon on the 8th, Gordon and Longstreet were beginning to enter Appomattox Court House, letting their men settle down to cook rations, a welcome reprieve from days of eating on the march. Some of Sheridan's cavalry engaged with Gordon's men, as well as a host of Confederate artillery. Night was coming on quick, which brought an end to the fighting. That night, Lee met with Longstreet, Gordon, and Fitzhugh Lee, his nephew and cavalry commander. He said that if it was only cavalry in their front, then Gordon and Fitzhugh would form battle lines in the morning west of the village and sweep the horsemen aside and press on to the west. Lee wasn't convinced that the Union infantry could have caught up to them. The next morning, on April 9, 1865, Gordon and Fitzhugh Lee formed their battle lines to contest the Federal cavalry blocking their way. At first, only 1 cavalry brigade formed against the Confederate line. Fitzhugh's cavalry easily overwhelmed that force and another brigade coming up to support it. Gordon's infantry swung its battle line to where it was looking more south than west, believing that he had opened up the road for the Army of Northern Virginia to continue their push west. He even informed Lee about the good news. However, the beleaguered Confederates soon gazed upon Union infantry forming in their front. Parts of the 24th and 5th Corps were now blocking their way. The Confederate Army was now blocked from the west by this force, and the east and northeast by the 2nd and 6th Corps. The only route of escape possible was to the northwest, but no major roads could carry them in that direction from Appomattox Court House. Lee then stated, "Then there is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Lee then sent word to Grant that he would like to discuss the terms of surrender, and sent flags of truce from his battle lines to stop the fighting. Lee initially sent the message to Grant to the east, thinking he was with the 2nd and 6th Corps, and Grant had indeed been moving with them, but had since left them and proceeded to the south and west across the Appomattox River to Sheridan's front. Lee sent off another message so that Grant would have a better opportunity to receive word from him, and then rested under the shade of an apple tree. Confusion ran throughout the battlefield as the flags of truce traveled between the various commanders. One account tells of Custer riding through the Confederate lines with a flag of truce and was escorted to Longstreet. There, Custer stated, "In the name of General Sheridan, I demand the unconditional surrender of this army." Longstreet glared at the young man, saying nothing and forcing Custer to repeat his words. When he did, Longstreet responded, "I am not the commander of this army, and if I were, I would not surrender it to General Sheridan." Custer was then escorted out of the Confederate lines. General Sheridan, Army of the James Commander Edward Ord, and others rode out and met with some general officers, including Gordon. Grant finally received Lee's message. Before that, he was suffering from a horrible headache, but as he later wrote, it cleared when he read Lee's message. Grant agreed to meet and asked him to find a suitable place. One of Grant's staffers, Orville Babcock, delivered the message personally to Lee. Lee asked his two aides, Charles Marshall and Walter Taylor, to join him, but Taylor declined. So Lee, Marshall, their orderly, Private Joshua O. Johns, Babcock, and his orderly, Captain William M. Dunn, rode toward the outskirts of Appomattox Court House. They stopped on the outskirts, and Marshall and Johns rode in to find a suitable place to hold the talks. They found Wilmer McLean and asked him where they could meet. McLean directed them to an unfurnished, run-down house. The Confederates told him that wouldn't do, so McLean offered his brick home on the western edge of the village. They agreed. McLean moved his family from around Manassas, where the first major land battle of the war took place. Now he directed the commanders of both sides' armed forces to his home to talk of surrender. Lee entered the home and waited in the parlor for Grant. It was almost 1:30 p.m. before Grant and his entourage made it to the McLean home. Upon entering the home, Grant found Lee standing in the parlor. They greeted one another and sat down at two desks. Marshall was the only accompanying officer with Lee. Grant came with a host of general officers. They didn't all stay in the parlor as the two generals met, but would move in and out of the home as the surrender took place. Lee was dressed in his best uniform and new sash, with a fine sword. Grant, on the other hand, came to the meeting having traveled roughly 18 miles, including fording a river. He wore a fatigue blouse with his 3-star shoulder straps and no sword. The two men started with small talk, speaking about their earlier careers in the Mexican War. It was Lee who spoke up and said, "General, I have come to meet you in accordance with my letter to you this morning, to treat about the surrender of my army. And I think the best way would be for you to put your terms in writing." Grant formulated his terms. They included that the paroled soldiers were free to return to their homes, and they would not be disturbed by the United States as long as they abided by their paroles and the laws where they reside. All government property would be turned over to the United States Army. Finally, all soldiers would be allowed to keep their sidearms. Lee brought up that the Confederate government didn't own the horses of the men, that, for example, the cavalrymen supplied their own mounts for service. Lee knew that the men would need their horses for spring planting when they returned home. Grant declined to change the wording, thinking politicians may make more of it than there actually was, and assured Lee that all of the men could keep their mounts. With that, Lee signed his statement surrendering the Army of Northern Virginia. The war was over for those soldiers. The two generals shook hands, and Lee proceeded to the front door of the home and went down the steps. Private Johns brought Traveler, Lee's horse, to the general. Lee mounted and saluted Grant, who saluted back. Then Lee, Marshall, and Johns rode east to inform his army. The men stood with their heads uncovered, listening to their general. Lee told them he did all he could for them, and told them to return to their homes and be as good citizens as they were soldiers. Lee then traveled along the stage road east and went into bivouac. Grant traveled to his headquarters about a mile to the west. Along the way, he sent a message about 4:30 p.m. to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. It read, "General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself. The accompanying additional correspondence will show the conditions fully." Word about the surrender soon spread throughout both armies. The Union bands began to play patriotic tunes in celebration. Grant ordered them to stop, saying, "The Confederates are now our prisoners, and we do not want to exult over their downfall." General Lee asked Marshall to write up a farewell address to the men. It read in part, "After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the brave survivors of so many hard-fought battles, who have remained steadfast to the last, that I have consented to this result with no distrust of them, with an increasing admiration for your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous considerations for myself, I bid you all an affectionate farewell." At 10 a.m. on April 10th, Grant and Lee met again. In their meeting, Grant tried to convince Lee to use his status as the commander of all Confederate forces to convince the other rebel armies to surrender. Lee said he would have to confer with Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, before he could do so. What came out of this second meeting was an agreement that each paroled soldier would receive a printed pass designating them as a paroled prisoner, and that soldiers passing through Union-occupied territory to get home were allowed free transportation on government railroads and vessels. 6 commissioners, 3 Union and 3 Confederate, met to finalize the surrender process. On the 10th, the cavalry would surrender, followed by the artillery on the 11th, then the infantry on the 12th. Grant appointed Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain to receive the surrender of the foot soldiers. On the 12th, the infantry marched into Appomattox Court House, with Gordon's corps in front, Longstreet's behind them, and what was left of A.P. Hill's old corps last in line. The infantry stacked their arms and emptied their cartridge boxes into the road. The Union infantry gathered the weapons and loaded them into wagons. Grant and Chamberlain's corps commander, Charles Griffin, informed Chamberlain that they wished the ceremony to be as simple as possible and that nothing should be done to humiliate the manhood of the Southern soldiers. Gordon and Chamberlain saluted one another as a sign of respect during the proceedings. As the last unit passed, one Southerner remembered. Someone in the blue line broke the silence and called for 3 cheers for the last brigade to surrender. But for us, this soldierly generosity was more than we could bear. Many of the grizzled veterans wept like women, and my own eyes were as blind as my voice was dumb. The rebel soldiers broke off into smaller groups and began their journeys back home. Over the course of the 3 days, 2,576 artillerymen, 1,559 cavalrymen, and 23,512 infantry surrendered. It's estimated that Grant lost about 8,600 soldiers from the time they began their pursuit until Appomattox Court House, the last campaign for the Army of the James, the Army of the Potomac, and the Army of Northern Virginia. A Union soldier strolled through the last camp of their once formidable enemy and commented, "I kept on through the sad remnants of an army that has its place in history. It would have looked a mighty host if the ghosts of all its soldiers that now sleep between Gettysburg and Lynchburg would have stood there in the lines beside the living." If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you.